We'll hear from another esteemed group of authors of the first issue of the journal, and then we will rotate over to a discussion with the author of the first book in the Antikythera book series, Blaise Aguirre-Yarcas, and that will conclude the program for the day. And so we'll get right back into it and try to keep the momentum going. We're joined by Nicolay, Boyadjiev, Chen, Qiufan, Lukáš, Likavčan, and Nina Beguš, all of whom have composed quite wonderful pieces for the first and second issue of the journal. We'll continue the conversation. I'm going to ask Nicolay to start us off to say a little bit of contributions on behalf of the many designers whom we worked with in all these articles, and talk a little bit about that process and their involvement, and because in many respects, depending on how you look at this, this is a journal of new digital design that happens to be using philosophy as its lorem ipsum, or it's a journal of philosophy that happens to be using cutting-edge design as its vehicle. So let's turn it inside out and tell us a little bit about the other half of the contributors.
Yes, it's a journal at the intersection of lorem and ipsum. Just a few words about, I guess, also my role as design director of Antikythera. I've also been really lucky to be the design editor of the journal, and just as was already quite mentioned a couple times, I'm sure there's easier ways of doing a journal. But one of the benefits is that this collaboration is really meant to think about the role of design within that equation, but also think about the actual contributions that go in both directions. Just a few quick words about, obviously the journal is heavily, ideas have fonts, ideas have gradients, ideas have colors, and therefore it was an exercise of thinking about the type of design practices that could have a contribution to be made. So a huge thanks to, of course, Channel Studio, who were involved with us throughout the way of building the journal. Giga, who also helped us to program this kind of movie you can read. More fundamentally though, just another word about, because it is the architectural biennial, a lot of our thinking was, again, what is a meaningful contribution of the design discipline within this? Is it just about decoration? Is it about essentially making it look sexy? Or is there something more to be added here? And there was a lot of interesting, or at least two main reasons why thinking about it through this lens was meaningful. On the one hand, because we were working with many serious professionals and practitioners, they also worked through different scientific models and digital models and predictive and all sorts of ways of thinking about modeling that comes from their particular disciplines. The way that designers think about modeling, we talked about this a lot, but also in our previous collaborations at the Strzok Institute before Antikythera, was that designers approach this, the literacy with model making from a projective standpoint, from a normative standpoint, from the, not what it is, but what it could be, which is a literacy with models that is native to the design field, that is native to the architectural community, but not always native to the communities that we're working with. So that was a very interesting entry point into an additional layer of model making within those professional disciplines. The other thing, also learning from the second point, is basically the relationship between speculative design, as it was already mentioned, and architecture's sort of long legacy of being able to divorce the application design from solving problems and just thinking through culture, thinking through something without the need to either critique or resolve, without sort of this kind of false dichotomy of solutionism versus critique. And therefore, that second aspect, which again is native to architects, if you go to the Arsenale, to the Giardini, you'll see a lot of examples of this kind of speculative design, which is really now a genre. It's a style, kind of a one-point perspective megastructure sort of generation. But that culture was not necessarily native to some of the professionals and actually the field of software design, and also the field of working with this. So maybe afterwards we can also talk a little bit more about scenario fiction, the genre that we were attempting to prototype with the Hem Stacks project. But both of these what entry points within the generation of the articles were, I think, really generative in both directions. A lot of our studio collaborators are here, so you might also ask them what they learned in the process and how it liberated them from essentially solving or critiquing by just thinking through the disciplines with the collaborators.
Great, thank you, Nicolay. So to start off this particular group, I should also say that Daniel van der Velden of Metahaven won't be able to join us today. The vaunted Dutch logistics broke down on his behalf. He wasn't able to arrive. But the theme of the speculative and the counterfactual, I think, is one that really runs through this particular group of authors. And to pick up the thread from the previous panel about how that rotation within modeling, conceptual modeling and physical modeling, that shifts from prediction to the entertainment of counterfactuals through which a contingent choice is to be made, can be, in some respects, is indeed a kind of design genre. It's sort of just kind of rhetorical form, and in others is quite clearly a mode of intelligence, a mechanism that is both both compositional and navigational within space. And each of you kind of work through this in a few different kinds of ways. You also have individual pieces that you're working on, but let me start with one of the projects that we're doing. It's a kind of collectively authored project within Antikythera, which has to do with what we call hemispherical stacks. On the previous panel, Amy mentioned a book I wrote, a book called The Stack, some time ago, which sort of outlined a kind of basic architecture of how planetary computation works. And one of the phenomena that has accelerated and become more radicalized since that book was published is a kind of fragmentation or multipolarization of planetary computation, not only through the multipolarization of geopolitics, but in ways in which we might even say that these fragmentations are the same thing, one because the other. And so the project, which we're working on with Stanley and Lukáš in particular, helping to co-pilot, has to do with a way of trying to find a new way of doing an old form of political science speculative design, which was called scenario planning, which, going back to the middle of the 20th century, the Rand Corporation and Herman Kahn and Dr. Strangelove and others, became a way of producing kind of official futures that governments would make policy decisions and indeed fight wars in relationship to the implications of these little science fiction stories that they would tell each other about what was likely to happen. And so what we were interested in is, as we sort of move into uncharted territories through a deeply computational form of geopolitics, we're not exactly what is likely to occur next. What are the counterfactuals that we should be entertaining in a navigational sense, even before a compositional sense, is one that has both deep philosophical interest, but also perhaps some practical value. So, who better to, particularly in terms of a lot of this dynamic between this multipolarization occurs between, not exclusively, but often quite dramatically between the United States and China. Who better to collaborate with to try to think through some of these scenarios than science fiction authors, and who better among science fiction authors to collaborate with than Chinese science fiction authors. And Stanley has been a longtime friend, long before this project even began, but is one that we sort of co-conceived together. And as I say, Lukáš is also sort of driving a lot of the editorial process of gathering these together. So just to start us off, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the composition of counterfactuals and even fictionalization operates as a kind of key intellectual technology in your writing, and then maybe ask you to think a little bit about how you see the project shaping up and the kinds of range of contributions that we're developing in that way. So please.
Yeah. Thanks, Benjamin, and thanks Antikythera, MIT, and Berggruen Institute brought me to Venice again. So we talk about like science fiction. We always trap in this kind of stereotype. Sometimes I'm just I want to express something, but I have to make up a cliche story, maybe a romance. I need some characters to carry on my ideas. But in our forthcoming book, it's a series of books. I think we open up the floor to maybe we don't need the plots, maybe we don't need the characters, maybe we don't need the relationships. But we put all these real factors. We try to create this kind of highly speculative, but also plausible version of future. Maybe it's contradictory within the same book. So it's very important how we curate, how we orchestrate the whole book as a structure. So think about the architecture. So I think this also reminds me the very typical futurology. So as a disciplinary, so back in the 80s in China, it's a very hit topic because China just opened up after the Cultural Revolution. So we embraced the whole incoming wave of philosophy, literature, and all these theories from the West. So this so-called futurology become a hit topic. Even now, there is still an institute officially exists. All those old folks, over 80 something, they're still in the organization. So now we try to reinvent the terminology. We try to use more narratives to help people step in and try to catch up with the reality. Now I'm talking about science fiction maybe is the only realism from a literature perspective, because we are dealing with the real issue. We're dealing with the daily life. And even though we are so difficult to catch up with every week irritation of AI, new models, new applications, etc., etc. So when we think about it, I think it's more important how we bring in this kind of diverse perspective people, and also how can we I'm not set up the framework or any methodology to help people to think, oh, what is scenario fiction, or how we should conjuring all of factual ideas to integrate into one narrative. But I want it to be, let me put it this way, it's multi-layer, it's multi-dimensional, and also it's cross modality. So think about when, as a writer, so I right now I love to go to exhibitions like this. I capture more abstract models from other medium formats, rather than reading books or from all those films, TVs, whatsoever. So I think this kind of cross-modality, sensation or perception help us to think beyond our own limitation. So let me use a metaphor. Can you feel a model? Can you taste an algorithm? Can you smell the data set in a way? So I think this is something we try to do with all this great design and help us to think beyond that as an individual, so put it in a collective way.
Great, thank you, Cindy. So Lukáš, there's two contributions I'd love to speak to you, and also, Nina, also, if you don't mind, I'd like you to also talk a bit about the Artificial Humanities book that you're publishing as well. But before we get to the, there's two contributions. One is, again, the hemispherical stacks, which has to do with the, as Sam said, with the scenario fictions sort of genre that we've conjured here, and we talk a little bit about that. But also to invite you to talk about the long L and your own work as a kind of, one of a few young philosophers that's kind of starting with the question of the planetary or the comparative planetology after Stan Robinson, and how the question of the counterfactual even plays into the necessity of that work. But why don't we start with the hem stacks?
I think that's a good idea, because I would say that the idea of the space of possibilities or counterfactuals that really runs through both of my contributions. I mean, just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Lukáš and I'm a researcher at Antikythera. I'm very fortunate to be part of the team over the past year. And basically, the work that we do at the moment at Hemispherical Stacks is kind of about developing a new methodology for scenario planning. Narrative is a kind of hidden model, basically. Any narrative helps us to intuitively understand relations, dynamics between different agents. And in this sense, we are using narratives that have a very particular kind of flavor, I would say, that makes them also unique to and different from, for example, Rand Corporation scenario planning of 1960s and 70s is also different from speculative fiction in a certain sense, because we are not, as already Stanley said, we are not relying that much on characters and plots that are driven by individuals. We really want to do scenario planning as a methodology that is based on system levels dynamics, that is based on causality and tracing these causalities between different agents and clusters of agents. We want to be deliberately realistic, which means that we are not doing scenario planning for 1,000 years or 50 years. We are looking into really near term. And there is a kind of a specific reason why we want to look into the near-term future, because we want to extrapolate. We want to realistically extrapolate. And this extrapolation is not only about like how we look into future from the present, but also how we can use future as a way how to talk about the present, yeah? So in this sense, we are trying to do something as an archaeology of present through these different scenarios, to see the hidden forces, dynamics that are already shaping the present and can be like really realistically extrapolated into, let's say, 10, 15 years from now. And last but not least, this is really also about building some institutional tool. This is something that can be deployed in context of different institutions. It's been deployed in the past, as I already mentioned, for example, RAND. I'm sure that many companies and architects are also relying to some form of scenario planning. And of course, there's a lot of computational models around that are doing this kind of job. And in this sense, scenario planning that we're doing can be something like an additional layer of speculation that can be built on top of the skeleton of possible futures that computational models can give us in this sense. And so just to tell you a little bit on the practical side, we hope to deploy something like a studio for writers down the line about hemispherical stacks, something like 2 weeks of writing retreat for a group of writers. But at the moment, we are commissioning pieces. We are commissioning individual contributions by authors ranging from sci-fi authors, for example, Taiyo Fuji. We are very fortunate to also work with institutions such as Singapore Center for Strategic Future. George Farley is doing like really great scenario work in that context. And of course, like some of the other Berggruen usual suspects, like Niels Gilman, for example. And in this sense, we are commissioning these pieces for an article that is going to be released with the second issue of the MIT journal that is going to be launched in October. So that's for the framing. And the end goal, Stanley already mentioned this, is the book with MIT Press down the line.
Let me transition this to Nina. So, you mentioned RAND, and we've been in some conversations with RAND that I don't think have been as fruitful as some of the other ones we've had. No one from RAND is here to this one. But one of the things I also just want to add, just as like a little bit of cherry on top, as opposed to the way in which we're kind of approaching this scenario fiction here as well, is I think this kind of scenario work works best when it is as agnostic as possible as to whether or not the scenario that you're describing is one that you would want to happen or would not want to happen. And indeed, the scenarios that, by the contrary, the less certain you are whether or not it would be a good thing or a bad thing, then perhaps there's more to be learned from it in one way or in a way or another. And I think to a certain extent that ambiguity is sometimes read as ambivalence, and they're not really quite the same thing. But let me turn to the project as well. Okay, so Nina, you and Gaspar and Daniel and Vinka of MetaHaven have been working on a project that sounds as if it were science fiction, but is actually not. And so we're kind of going the other direction here as well. And so you and Gaspar at Berkeley have been working on, I don't want to give too much of this away, but have been working on the use of machine learning, Gaspar being a linguist, he is a humanist, we're working on the use of machine learning to try to interpret animal communications as if, with some sort of a open-endedness as to whether or not this constitutes something like language. And it's this boundary between what is and isn't language within signaling that is really, I think, at the heart of both this research, but also the piece that we see here. And so I wonder if you could just, on behalf of all the collaborators, talk a little bit about this project and where it came from, and then ask you to talk a bit about, your position as a humanist doing a kind of work that, quite frankly, many humanities departments might find quite confusing. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate your interest in our work. Now, this piece that we're presenting here is really focused on latent spaces. Latent spaces are present pretty much in all computational models, and are these epistemological frameworks really that shape how models see the world, imagine, and how they produce. So we approach these through GANs, generative adversarial networks, that were very popular a few years ago, like 7 years ago, with pictures of fake cats, but we use them for speech. We work on language. And so with speech, because we've studied language so much in humans, we can access it better in machines as well. Now, latent spaces, right, they're tricky for us humans, because first of all, they are this latency, right? This latency is a bit metaphorical, but really when you look at what this latency is, it's this vast organized structure of vectors that have hundreds or thousands of dimensions. So they are unimaginable to us humans. And what we were trying to do with this particular project is to really access the latent space of this GANs model trained on English, and to show with different techniques to visualize this radically invisible space to us humans. Of course, latent spaces are not to be perceived by humans. They are there for algorithms to operationalize. Now, going to language a little bit, why we work with speech. The way we see speech is more primary than, say, text, right? Text is a derivative. For speech, we have all the apparatus that we need to produce it right here in our bodies. It comes with the human outfit. With text, this is basically our first information technology, right? You need some kind of technological help. And there's this big idea that philosophers and scientists have been playing with. Currently in neuroscience, there's this big debate, can we equate thought to language or not? The field is still split. It's a 50-50. But what we're doing here really is to say, okay, thought is in this latent space, either in artificial or in biological neural networks in our brain. And then the next step is language. Language is an abstraction of thought or a representation of thought. And then you move further into another representation in a language model as a representation of language, of digitized language. And then the third order, I think, representation, we're now in the image realm of what of how an AI model is representing that language. So basically that was our goal. Now the paper that's coming out in October is a little broader. We're basically looking at the whole landscape of language in humans, animals, and machines. Gaspar works with whales. He's a linguist lead at the project SETI. They focus on sperm whales. Then Irene Pepperberg, who has studied this Einstein ferret, Alex, has given us data of Alex babbling at night, practicing, talking to himself, and we're going to publish that with the paper as well. It's adorable. There's a lot of silences, but there's this rhythmical aspect to it. You can kind of see Alex enjoying it. There's more. There's elephants with Joyce Poole, who's like Jane Goodall of elephants, singing spiders, and so on. So we will bring in Alex for a particular reason, because there's this isomorphic parallel to how GANs are learning language, speech, how Alex is learning. Alex is an animal, right? He is learning human language. He had to crawl all the way to us to show some kind of intelligence in the human form. And then we have, machines and literature as well. We have Joyce with Finnegan's Wake, where basically Joyce inadvertently narrated the latent space. There's a lot of words in Finnegan's Wake that are nonce words. So nonce words are the words that are that just occur once. So they could theoretically be words in English. They work with English phonology, but we just kind of haven't accepted them as words yet. And Blaise, actually in your book, you say if you zip your book, you could zip it to like 35% or something, and that if you zip Ulysses, it would be 40. I think Finnegan's Wake would surely 45 or something, because there's so many novel words, and that's what GANs do as well. So basically, we gave them 8 words of English, and they produce. You can't keep them. You can't keep them back from being imaginary and creative. They just like keep coming with new words. The first one was actually start. But they come up with actual English words, coffee, Nancy, carrot, blue car, or they come up with nonce words, just like Joyce, who's kind of creating his own idiom. So that's for the paper. Now what I do, Benjamin nicely allowed me to introduce my forthcoming book. What I think about fiction, I started as a literary scholar. Fiction for me is just as part of this world as anything else. There's nothing unreal about fiction. And my book, which is titled Artificial Humanities, with this goal to bring humanities into text spaces, to bring this deep knowledge of humanistic insights into the very creation of AI, is really looking at fictional representations of AI and paralleling them with actual historical ways that we look at it. And I put Pierre Huyghe's mask from his recent exhibition, Liminal, onto the cover, because there's this one trajectory that I found in the imaginary landscape of AI, which is this human likeness, right? Putting on a persona, a character. And this is basically what the book is about. It's tracing all of these ways. It also shows that Lem is one of the rare authors that is able to step out of this, that is able to imagine a non-human intelligence or a machine in a way that's not completely anthropomorphized. Okay, 2 more books down the pipeline, just to mention. Stanley is part of one. We put together this volume of professional writers, creative writers, thinking about how the space of writing and reading has changed with the entry of AI into it. And then another book is really on the planetary end. It's a co-authored work with a bioscientist. And I feel there's a lot of resonance with even the previous panel and what we've been talking about here and what Blaise is doing now with his new books. But these scientists, these are Earth system scientists, they had a philosophy in their lab, and this is why we were kind of there to extract it, and this is why we had to write the book. And it's really about not differentiating between natural, biological, human and technological systems. The way biogeochemistry works, it just does not translate into this kind of modern ontology, yes. And so we had to break it. And the way they look about, they think about it all is through thermodynamics and the way information is being passed on in different Earth systems with a goal to really optimize for efficiency in how we build and think throughout Earth systems. So technology, computing, but also language, culture, and so on.
Yeah, I think that de-differentiation is really core to what
That's
Antikythera is all about, right? I mean, this sort of things. But sort of starting then from where I mean, if Santa Fe Institute is starting from the math side, we're starting from the humanities side, but maybe it comes to this a little. But what I'd like to do is just open it up to sort of the multi-way sort of questions. But I just want to bookmark something that you said that I've always a thought I like. It's just a fun thought to have, that the embeddings visualizations of the models, right? So if thought is a representation of the world, and language is either the representation of the thought or it is the thought itself. But then there's the representation of the language that it may be the thought. And then the large language model is a representation of that language, and the embeddings visualization is a representation of this. The embeddings visualization is the representation of the representation of the representation of the representation. Is the way around. That's the masks. I suppose, on this here as well. So with that, let me please just invite anyone, just however you'd like to comment to each other or ask questions.
I would really love to follow up on what Nina just said about the differentiation between these different metaphysical, philosophical categories like nature, artificial, technology, human, and also like on Benjamin's comment about like this is really the core agenda of Antikythera in a certain way, because I guess like there are different devices of the differentiation or like different prisms or lenses through which you can approach this kind of space, and one of them of course is Earth system science, and I'm kind of like in a dialogue with a very like closely aligned form of, the differentiation, which is astronomy, and especially astrobiology and SETI. Because to me, it feels like when we really abstract away from the terrestrial circumstances, from the circumstances of this Earth, this planet, that's the moment when we discover something like a substrate agnostic ecology. That means ecology, which really doesn't take into account these metaphysical differentiations, but instead talks about complexity, layers, talks about dynamics between agents and metabolisms in a way that's more formal, more about abstraction and mathematics, and less about this feels good because it's natural and this feels bad because it's technical, made from steel, and it's making a lot of noise, or the other way around. Yeah? Or it's shiny, yeah. So when you look into history of astrobiology and search for extraterrestrial intelligence, usually these endeavors were a little bit on the fringe of interest because they were deemed to be very like science fiction-like, yeah? But in fact, they tell us a lot about our Earth in many important senses. In 1941, George Gamow, one of the great minds in astronomy, co-author of the theory of how stars actually work, like how they produce energy, he wrote a book which is called Biography of Earth. And in this book, I actually discovered it thanks to Tom Moynihan, this book. And in this book, he coined the term comparative planetology. It's the first time that the term comparative planetology was actually used back then. And he uses this wonderful analogy with anatomy. When we study different organisms, we also learn something about ourselves as organisms. In the same way, when we study different planets, their conditions of habitability, the condition of existence of another form of life on another planet, we discover something important about our planet, what is the space of possibilities in which life and intelligence can sit. But down the line, it kind of complicates the whole idea of life as something that we know based on this one example of life that is here on Earth. Instead, this is how we discover, slowly, what's the real big picture of life. That terrestrial life is just one way how life can be, and that down the line, even technospheres, even technologies can be counted as a certain form of evolving life. And we had this debate here before with Vinny about like, for example, what is the unit of evolution in terms of AI? And these are exactly the same problems that philosophers of science are grappling with in biology. Is an individual organism unit of evolution? Is it a niche? Is it a population of agents? Is it, for example, a whole ecosystem? And I think these questions now we can start really ask with new agents having on the board, which are, for example, AIs, which are, for example, autonomous agents, whether they are virtual or whether they are actually materialized in the form of embodied robots, autonomous cars, etc. And these are all agents in ecology. They are not something that suffocates the ecology, something like a technosphere that sits and doesn't allow the biosphere to breathe. These are really just new agents in the biosphere. So in the long run, I hope also with the project of my personal article, which is called Long L, is also the pun on my name, because My first name starts with L, my second name starts with L, so there is a long L, so you can simply have LLL or O. And this short article, or short, it has over 20K words at the moment. I'm still writing it. But the goal is to really talk about substrate agnostic ecology as something that is based on two main, I would say, avenues through which we, as constructors of biosphere and technosphere, and or co-constructors in this way, how we can really intervene into this space. And that's assisted reproduction of the technosphere and biosphere, and assisted evolution of technosphere and biosphere. And I would be happy to talk about that more, but also I want to give the space to other panelists.
We are a little short on time, but I just want to, like, one thread to connect what you just said to something on the, in the previous discussion, has to do with this question of the getting outside of it, like the comparative logic of this, where if you have n of 1, of what constitutes life, what constitutes planetarity, what constitutes the relationship between population and niche, your model of what the possible counterfactuals and possibilities are is radically stunted. And it's this exogenous perspective is fundamentally necessary to actually comprehend this sort of spectrum, and that in essence makes all of this, all of the rest of this possible. Yeah. So please, anyone who'd like to sort of jump in, sort of last word on this. But
No, just a very quick, brief comment. Like, I just came across a paper, like a researcher using category theory to try to understand how different language mapping the concept across each other. So I think that's super fascinating. I think it just started. And think about what Lukáš just mentioned, like when we talk about one concept with from different dimension in different disciplinary, so how can we put all this concept, like a group of concepts within a relational, spatial, latent spatial in a way. So how we can, using the computation, whatsoever, modeling, and maybe someday I think we're close to there, like human can understand animal, but also humanity can understand scientists in a way. So you don't, even we're speaking the same language, but actually we're talking about different things, because all this context, all these backgrounds, all this, epistemological differentiation, everything. But maybe fundamentally, we can find a way to having the real conversation, but we need the interface.
by rediscovering, like we can find that language to have the conversation if we can figure out finally what language even is. Perhaps might be the thing. Okay, so I'm being told we're sort of at the cut here as well. So you hopefully in this last couple of panels you've got a little bit of sense of the flavor and tone and voice and inspiration and sort of vectors of inquiry that constitute the Antikythera Journal, which you can find at, funnily enough, journal.antikythera.org, which goes live. What's that? And the QR code above. That QR code actually works. It takes you to the journal, where you can read the first batch of dozen articles of the 2025 volume. The second one will come out this fall. And we look forward to your feedback on this, and hopefully to work with some of you in the future. We are going to quickly rotate to the last fourth panel of the day, which is, as mentioned, Amy mentioned, the Antikythera collaboration with MIT Press is not only the journal, but it's also a book series. And the first author in the book series, Blaise Guerriarcas, will be joining us, and he and I will enter into a little deeper discussion about what this book is all about. And then we will, I need to run off and have a debate to defend the honor of machine intelligence somewhere in a different building. So we'll see you in a moment. Would you rearrange the chairs? Don't move.